Hello. I would like to thank everyone for joining us today, December 3rd, International Day of Persons with Disabilities. So I'm Stephen Myers, an assistant professor in international studies, law, societies and justice, and disability studies here at the University of Washington. And I am also, along with Megan McCloskey, whom you will be meeting shortly, the co-founder of the Disability Inclusive Development Initiative here at the University of Washington. Before we begin today's program, I'd like to make you aware of a few points of accessibility. The first is that we are providing communication access real-time translation, or CART, captioning throughout today's seminar. You can access the captioning through a stream text link that we are putting into the chat box now. So to access captioning, go to the chat and simply click on the link. Secondly, as you can see, we are providing sign language interpretation throughout today's seminar. Later in our presentation, we will be showing a PowerPoint. To make it easier to see the interpreter during that portion of the event, you may want to use Zoom's side-by-side gallery setting, which you can access from the upper right corner of your screen. Please note this feature is not available on mobile platforms. Also, as we have two sign language interpreters, they will be switching on and off every 15 minutes. They will provide a warning a couple minutes before they switch in the chat so that you know to look for the new screen if you'd like to pin it. Lastly, for those of you using a screen reader, the PowerPoint that we will be using has alt text so that your screen reader can capture it. We're placing the PowerPoint, we're going to ask you to message us in the chat with your email and we can send you the PowerPoint so that you can access it and follow along during that portion of the presentation. Finally, before we begin, I would like to thank our supporters and partners who made today's event possible. They are the UW Office of Global Affairs, which is hosting today's webinar, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which supports the Jackson School of International Studies International Policy Institute, where the Disability Inclusive Development Initiative is housed, the UW Disability Studies Program, Disabled People International, Humanity and Inclusion, and finally, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, which commissioned the Students with Disabilities, School Violence and Bullying as a Barrier to Education for All report that we will be presenting today. So without further ado, I would like to present Dr. Leila Fernandez, Director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Leila is an internationally recognized scholar and author on democratic politics and inequality with a focus on contemporary India. She just recently joined us here at the UW, having formerly served in the Department of Women's Studies at the University of Michigan. We're really glad to now have her with us in Seattle. So Leila, I'm turning things over to you for welcoming remarks.
Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm just delighted to be here today on December 3rd, International Day of Disability. As Stephen mentioned, this is my first year at the University of Washington and my first year as director of the Jackson School. And the reason I moved here in the middle of a pandemic is because the Jackson School really embodies, in addition to its national reputation, it really embodies a distinctive approach to international studies. The Jackson School has historically always focused on the importance of understanding context, culture, history, respecting diverse intellectual traditions, respecting diverse cultural and historical contexts of different regions of the world. Also, the Jackson School has a very, very strong focus on questions of equality and equal rights, human rights. And that is something I care very deeply about. And I'm just delighted to be here as part of this event. One of the things we do at the Jackson School is we have a very broad understanding of public engagement. And we are particularly interested in approaches that combine public service and policy issues, along with the depth of context. And I cannot think of a better model for that approach than the endeavor which we are all part of today. One challenge the world faces, as you all know, is promoting the rights of persons with disabilities to participate in all aspects of life on an equal basis with others. I think you'll agree with me that both the right to education and the right to live free of violence are fundamental aspects of life. I think you will also agree with me by the end of today's event that this report on students with disabilities not only addresses this important issue, but also shows us how research of this kind needs to be done. I was particularly delighted to learn that not only did this UNESCO commissioned study build off and connect to the Jackson School's expertise in disability inclusion, but that the Disability Inclusive Development Initiative, which produced the report, involved students. This matters a great deal to the Jackson School. And it included students with disabilities as well in the research process. And I think that's incredibly important, and I'm just delighted to see that. So I'm particularly excited for everyone today to hear from several of our students in this project who worked on this project and on this report and are playing such a vital role in addressing this important issue. I think that's a model for the future, and I'm looking forward as the director of the Jackson School to supporting more endeavors of this kind and to working with all of you as we continue to focus on questions of disability rights. So having said that, I'd like to welcome you to the Students with Disabilities event, School Violence and Bullying as Barriers to Education for All. And thank you, Stephen, for including me in this wonderful project.
Okay, thank you so much, Leila. So next, I would like to introduce Dr. Mohamed Latfey, Executive Director of Disabled Peoples International. In addition to being director, Mohamed also serves as the representative of DPI at the United Nations, where he co-chairs the stakeholder group of persons with disabilities to the high-level political forum on sustainable development goals. He was also the co-founder and the executive director of the Arab Forum for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And so I'd like to turn things over to you, Dr. Latfey.
Thank you, Dr. Stephen. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for the organizers to invite me to this very important and exciting event. I'm really looking forward to hearing from other participants, panelists, and experts having their presentations and sharing their thoughts about this very important topic. I would like to start from where Dr. Fernandez stopped, where emphasizing the role of education and promoting the rights of persons with disabilities to inclusion in society. We at Disabled Peoples International, and on my own personal capacity as a PhD in anthropology, we find inclusive education as a key strategy to terminate all forms of exclusion, stigma, and discrimination in society. One key experience, one important experience that persons with disabilities have experienced historically over the last or many decades now is the problem of institutionalization. Institutionalization is the source of uh, all stigma or perpetual stigma, exclusion, discrimination that persons with disabilities are experiencing. And lots of people nowadays are trying to work collectively together to terminate these forms of institutionalization and segregation against persons with disabilities. Now, lots of organizations around the world have been behind tremendous and very important pioneer initiatives on promoting inclusive education. However, we still hear voices from many special education specialists, even among DPOs around the world, even though they are still like minor, but also very influential in determining policies on education for persons with disabilities around the world, that inclusive education is still not sufficiently well managed, especially when we see how bullying is still ongoing against students with disabilities in mainstream schools. Uh, Despite all of these claims, we think that we cannot stay or sit back and not work on promoting inclusive education just because of bullying. We believe that instead of finding in special education or institutionalization as a solution, we believe that we should work together as DPOs, policymakers, special education specialists, and also policymakers, even academicians like your university here, to promote inclusive education. We have to recognize that organizations that have been behind projects on inclusive education, especially in developing countries, are lacking lots of support, lacking lots of community awareness around the significance of inclusive education. So what we need to, what we'd like to suggest that in order for us to stop bullying, we need to work together on transforming the sociocultural perspective about disability, especially in developing countries or in the global south. We see lots of support coming from organizations like the World Bank, like a major multilateral funding organization, and many others to support inclusive education. However, the emphasis on awareness raising and changing behaviors of students and teachers and educators, school specialists, psychosocial support specialists, is still very minimum. We need to expand more on this and not to see that inclusive education can be only through accessible buildings and equipments, even though these are very important items within the realm of inclusive education, but we have to balance that with the work on supporting psychosocial programs for ensuring that students uh, who are not disabled should respect the right of their peers with disabilities to have access to inclusive education and enjoy fully equal access to mainstream schools and show important show that disability should not remain trapped in the realm of liminality and exclusion in society. So I would like to stop here. I think I'm reaching my time, and I would like to hear more from you. And I'm here. I will be around, listening, and also if are any questions, I'm here to answer. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mohamed. And just for everybody participating today, please keep in mind that you can put your questions into the chat. And then at the end of today's program, we'll have half an hour for a Q&A session. So as questions come to your mind, just put them in the chat and we'll be looking at them and recording them as we go. So, and now I would like to invite Mr. Parvez Abduvohobov, Program Specialist in UNESCO's section of Health and Education, to introduce the Students with Disabilities School Violence and Bullying as a Barrier to Education study.
Good morning. It's an honor and a privilege to be invited to participate in this important event. And I'm delighted to be here today with you on 3rd of December, the International Day of Persons with Disabilities. I wish to thank the Jackson School of International Studies, particularly Professor Leila Fernandez, Stephen Myers, and Megan McCloskey for this kind invitation. I bring greetings and best wishes from our team in Paris. As introduced by Stephen, my name is Parvez Abduvohobov and I work for UNESCO, which is a specialized technical agency of the United Nations. It promotes peace and security through international cooperation in education, science, and culture. I'm a part of the team that coordinates UNESCO's activities related to the creation of safe and healthy learning environment, including prevention and tackling of school violence and bullying. It goes without saying that school violence and bullying can be devastating for the victims. The consequences include missing classes, avoiding school activities, dropping out of school. This in turn negatively impacts academic achievement and future employment prospects. Overall, an atmosphere of anxiety, fear, insecurity undermine the quality of education, not only for the victims, but for all learners. And we believe that addressing school violence and bullying is essential in order to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, in particular SDG 4, which aims to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education for all, and SDG 16, which promotes peaceful and inclusive societies. There are many areas that our team works on, and one of them is knowledge generation through research and strengthening evidence base on the topic. Our most recent work in this area was the publication of the Behind the Numbers report in 2019, which presented the evidence on the nature, scope, and impact of school violence and bullying around the world. It was a groundbreaking report, which confirmed that violence at school is a widespread phenomenon, occurs in all countries, affects significant numbers of children and adolescents. The evidence suggested that 1 in 3 children has been bullied by their peers at school in the past months. Physical bullying is the most common, and sexual bullying is the second most frequent type of bullying across all regions, except for Europe and North America, where psychological bullying prevails. 1 in 3 children has at least once experienced a physical attack in the past year. 1 in 10 children is affected by cyberbullying nowadays, and we fear that COVID-19, the pandemic, has further exacerbated this situation. While our report revealed some eye-opening and interesting trends, it also identified the gap in the knowledge. And one of them was the limited evidence on the experience of school violence and bullying among learners with disabilities. We didn't know a lot about the prevalence, the risk factors that increase the vulnerability and exposure of learners with disabilities to violence, especially within school and other learning settings. This, you agree, and as you can imagine, is a huge barrier that hinders the delivery of effective policies and programs for safe, inclusive, and healthy learning environment for all children, including students with disabilities. With this in mind, this year, we commissioned a literature review on this subject with a plan to inform our international dialogue and advocacy efforts. We were lucky to have Stephen Meyers and Megan McCloskey working with us on this literature review. They did a great job in reviewing the published and great literature and developing a very comprehensive report, which is rich for findings. In addition, they offered us an exciting approach to the desk review, which included involving young people and those with disabilities in the research, conducting consultations with key informants, including from the disability community, from various regions and countries of the world. I want to underline that the inclusion of people with disabilities in the research or decision-making on the issues that affect their lives are imperative. It ensures research truly reflects their perspectives and focuses on the issues of greatest importance to them. Overall, in UNESCO, we are very happy with our collaboration and with the quality of report Stephen and Megan and their team produced. The findings of the report were already presented in the International Symposium on Inclusive Education last week, which was co-organized by UNESCO and the Ministry of Education of Portugal. We are planning on publishing it next year, continue using the findings in all our advocacy and policy dialogue efforts. With that, I will now stop and hand over to Megan to present the findings of their excellent review. I assure you it's a great presentation with a lot of interesting findings and recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you, Parvez. I'm delighted to join everybody this morning and share some of the findings. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen quickly here. And so, as a way of framing the potential challenge and the size of the relevant population that we were looking at, it's important to bear in mind that there's not reliable data on the number of children and young adults with disabilities around the world, but the WHO estimates that it could be as many as 150 million children under the age of 18, children with disabilities, or potentially quite a lot more. And that equates to about 1 in 20 children of school age. As Parvez noted, the purpose of the literature review was to understand the state of knowledge regarding school violence and bullying involving children and young people with disabilities, recognizing that that population is very diverse We adopted an intersectional lens for the review and considered the resources through 4 nested layers, starting first with disability. And the intent here was to understand how factors like gender, age, family disadvantage, disability type, and learning settings could make certain students with disabilities more vulnerable to school violence or bullying, or might be protective in certain cases. And we looked at the idea of involvement in bullying holistically. So recognizing that students with disabilities may experience school violence and bullying as victims, certainly, but also as perpetrators and potentially as witnesses or bystanders. The findings and recommendations are drawn from a rapid review of the academic peer-reviewed literature, as well as reports and data prepared by or for UN agencies, the gray literature. They also reflect input gathered during consultation with current and former students with disabilities in focus groups conducted in South Africa, China, Jamaica, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Indonesia, and the United States. The focus groups included about 70 young people with diverse disabilities. And we received input from over 30 disability rights advocates and experts in the fields of inclusive education and child protection who helped validate the findings. Overall, the review identified more than 1,000 articles, of which more than 300 were selected for further review. But one of the important findings is that the research is unevenly distributed geographically, as you can see. Nearly half of the articles selected exclusively used data originating in North America, primarily in the US. An additional 25% of the studies drew on data from Western Europe, which means that about 3/4 of the studies involved Western Europe or the US only. The remaining articles were from Asia and the Pacific, in which Australia was dominant, Africa, Central and South America, and the Middle East. In Africa alone, there were 22 articles, and data used in 10 of those were drawn from South Africa, and another 4 were just from Uganda. Another important finding is that the overwhelming majority of the studies rely on data from high-income countries. Just 2%, or 5 articles total, focused on low-income countries, and 4 of those 5 were from Uganda. Given what we know, that estimates suggest that as many as 80% of persons with disabilities live in developing countries, which of course includes children and young adults with disabilities, the disparity in research suggests a critical need for more research to ensure that we're actually capturing the experiences of all learners with disabilities, especially those in the global South. Despite that, we can still learn a lot from the research that has been done. With regard to overall prevalence, findings of the prevalence of school violence and bullying experienced by children and young people with disabilities vary substantially, depending on research designs. As I said, students with disabilities are diverse, and findings regarding prevalence show differences that depend in part on how disability is defined for purposes of the study and which students with disabilities are included. However, one pattern is that in every study reviewed for this report, the students with disabilities included in that study were as or more likely than their non-disabled peers to be victims of school violence and bullying, and in some cases, significantly so. And this is true for every level of schooling, from early childhood education through primary, secondary, and into higher education. What you see there in the infographic is a few select data from a few select studies. And for example, one study from Finland involving preschool age children, ages between 3 and 6, with special educational needs, found that they were twice as likely to be victims of bullying and 4 times as likely to be both bullies and victims as their non-disabled peers. In a study in South Korea, primary school students with autism spectrum disorder were more than 4 times as likely to be bullied than their non-disabled peers. There's very few cross-country comparisons, but this infographic is developed from one of those, and it's a study comparing the prevalence of peer victimization among students between ages 11, 13, and 15 in 11 different European countries and Canada. And what you see there is that in every country, at every age group, the students with disability or chronic illness experience peer victimization at higher rates than their non-disabled peers. And in some cases, the rates were almost double. With regard to students with disabilities as perpetrators of school violence and bullying, there is some data that suggests students with disabilities are not only more likely to be victims of violence, but they're also more likely to be perpetrators of it. However, researchers that analyze the relationship between victimization and perpetration have found that students with disabilities are overrepresented among those who are both bullies and victims. In a study involving more than 1,000 fifth grade students in the US, the researchers found that American fifth grade boys with disabilities were 3 times, and fifth grade girls with disabilities were nearly 5 times more likely to be perpetrators and victims of bullying than boys and girls without disabilities, but were no more likely to be bullies absent previous victimization. In other words, what researchers are suggesting is that students with disabilities may be reacting to being bullied themselves by striking back, or they may be learning bullying behaviors from their non-disabled peers. There are some studies of how students with disabilities respond to school violence and bullying, comparing those responses to the responses of non-disabled students. And what they have found is that students with disabilities are as likely to use avoidance responses to peer aggression. They are more likely to strike back physically, but they're also 2 to 3 times more likely to report that when they report bullying to an adult, the bullying got worse. There's very little data on students with disabilities as bystanders or witnesses to bullying, but it's important because in one of the few primary school students with disabilities in the UK, they reported that seeing bullying was one of the top 3 most stressful scenarios for students with disabilities, more stressful than homework. While the studies reviewed differed with respect to how they defined and measured categories of school violence and bullying, results reported across studies suggest that students are affected by all types of school violence and bullying, and that across each type of violence, they're more likely than their non-disabled peers to be victimized. This includes physical violence, corporal punishment, psychological violence, including verbal and emotional abuse and social exclusion, sexual violence, and cyberbullying. And in every case, for almost every form of violence, they're more likely to experience more severe violence. So again, in this infographic, we see some statistics, some data from select studies, including a study of students with intellectual disabilities, in which half of them had been verbally abused or bullied, and more than 1/3 had experienced physical violence. It's notable that children whose conditions were visible in some of these studies, they noted that children whose conditions were visible were among the most likely to be bullied. The type of school violence and bullying to which learners may be subjected tends to vary by sex. Girls with disabilities are at more significant risk of sexual violence than their non-disabled peers, both inside and outside of school settings. So one study involving a sample of nearly 4,000 children between the ages of 11 and 14 in Ugandan primary schools found that 1 in 4 of the girls with disabilities had been sexually abused at some point in their lives, and that the girls with disabilities were more than twice as likely as their non-disabled female peers to experience violence at the hands of male peers and at school staff. Among college students in the US, as many as 1 in 3 young women with disabilities report having been sexually assaulted on campus, which is far more than non-disabled women students. A limited number of studies have also concluded that boys with disabilities are more vulnerable to sexual violence and harassment than their non-disabled male peers. In a study of dating violence among high school students in the US, researchers found that boys with disabilities reported dating violence at higher rates than both girls and boys without disabilities, although at much lower rates than girls with disabilities. Girls with disabilities are also more likely to experience emotional and relational violence than boys, while boys are more likely to experience physical violence. one thing the data is very limited is in with respect to students who identify who are non-binary. We were able to identify just 3 studies which had disaggregated their data to include students who identify as LGBTQI, but the number of students participating in those studies were so small, there was very little one was able to conclude from those. So it's an area in which there's a real urgent need for more research. I'm going to briefly touch on some of the factors that appear to increase the risk of school violence and bullying for students with disabilities, which include disability type, gender, poverty, family disadvantage, and that means the educational level of the parents, whether a parent has a disability, and prior experiences of violence. With regard to gender, for example, there's data that suggests that belief in gender norms, especially those concerning masculinities, can make boys with disabilities more vulnerable to sexual harassment, but can also make them more likely to sexual harass their female peers without disabilities in order to prove that they're a real man. One of the findings that I found most significant here is that one of the most significant risk factors is a prior history of victimization. In a longitudinal study in the US that involved more than 4,000 students with disabilities between the ages of 6 and 13, researchers found that a prior history of victimization was the greatest predictor of bullying victimization across time, more so than age, household income, disability type, or social competence. And other researchers have seen a similar correlation between childhood abuse in any setting, including in school settings, and the risk of future victimization. In a study published over the summer, researchers found that among college students with disabilities, a prior experience of peer victimization was the most significant predictor of future intimate partner violence among young women with disabilities. And when we think about that in reference back to the data that we see of students with disabilities experiencing victimization from a very, very early age, including during early childhood education, this idea, what this suggests is that the sooner interventions can occur and to reduce violence, the better. There's very few comparative studies that analyze students' involvement with school violence and bullying and disaggregate by disability type. However, studies that examine prevalence of school violence among students with particular disability types tend to find higher rates of victimization among students with disabilities than without across all types. Students with intellectual disabilities and multiple disabilities tend to report the highest rates of victimization compared with both non-disabled students and students with other disabilities, but there's really insufficient comparative work to be conclusive. So this is a lot of data. And one of the things that was particularly interesting about this study is that we were able to incorporate not only the quantitative data and the data pulled from the academic literature, but we were also able to hear from young people with disabilities themselves about their own experiences as students. And so I'd like to introduce Shasin Wang, who is a PhD candidate at the Jackson School of International Studies, who was incredibly helpful to this study and conducted 2 focus groups in China for us. So Shasin, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Megan, for this substantial literature review. So I am now presenting some of the findings we get from our focus group interview in China. So in September this year, we held 2 online focus groups among 14 participants with disability in China. So these participants, they were aged between 21 to 39, and we included a variety of impairment types, including physical, visual, hearing, and developmental impairment. And also this focus group participants, they have diverse forms of educational history. They go to both mainstream school and also special school. For those who went to special school, they included blind school and the school for the deaf. And also the years of schooling range from 6 years to 19 years. During our focus group interview, we provided sign language interpretation and real-time captioning to ensure accessibility of the interview. Next slide, please, Megan. Megan, could you turn to the next slide?
I'm sorry, it's just in here. Hang on one second. I might have to stop sharing.
Okay.
If you can continue, I'll try to figure this out.
Okay. In the next part, I'm going to present some of the findings we got from the interview. This will include forms of the school violence and where does it actually happen. And so from the participants' discussion, school violence and bullying actually happen from kindergarten to university and from special school to mainstream school. School violence and bullying in kindergarten and primary school are more likely to be in physical forms that involve fighting, attacking, and teasing, although psychosocial violence is also quite common. Psychological violence, such as social exclusion, stand out more after secondary school, which is aligned with students' psychosocial developmental stage. School violence and bullying also happen in both special school and mainstream school setting. In mainstream school, the perpetrators are more likely to be students and teachers without disability. However, in special school, abuses are perpetrated by teacher, elder student, and also student with quote-unquote less severe disability. Next slide, please. Participants also discuss a variety of forms of school violence that they personally experience. The first one is what I call impairment-targeted abuses. Other students would utilize and amplify the vulnerability of disabled students' impairment and impose emotional and physical abuse against them. For example, Fei, a person with autism, she reported that I have challenges in motor coordination and ran very slowly. Other students would take my belongings and ran quickly. I ran after them slowly and then they stopped for a while. Then when I almost caught up, they would run again. I could never catch up in this way. This kind of teasing made me feel very bad. And another group participant, Li Zi, she also reported that people imitated the way I walk on purpose and make everyone laugh. Next slide. And shockingly, almost all, a lot of group members reported that teachers are shockingly perpetrators of school violence and bullying against disabled students. Teachers very often believe that students with disability are causing trouble to their teaching and lowering the overall grades of the class. Therefore, they also abuse disabled students in different ways. One testimony provided by Ling Ling, a deaf person, is that I had a male classmate who was both deaf and had intellectual impairment. The teacher didn't like him at all. The teacher would speak openly in front of the whole class. Oh, that guy is an idiot. He's like a pig. He doesn't study well. He should just quit and go outside to work. But which boss would hire someone like him? He is totally useless. The teacher always says something like this. He quit it in 12th grade and worked in a noodle restaurant. Next slide. Almost all participants reported being called names that describe their impairment in degrading manner. A participant reported that she encounters both sexual harassment and cyberbullying in her secondary school. Other common forms of bullying include damaging personal belonging, physical abuse, verbal abuse, and social exclusion. Two examples of these other forms of school violence include one testimony from Latfey, again, a girl with autism. She described that when boys saw me, they acted like they saw the god of plague. They saw my belonging like they had virus. Classmates even put insecticide into my backpack. And then another group participant, Jiao Yang, she also mentioned that my body looked different than other kids. There were two boys in my class who would bully me without any reason. For example, they dragged my hair during break. Teacher didn't intervene at all. The most severe time was that they pushed me down on the ground and kept kicking me. I was just lying on the ground and let them kick on me. I became so frightened that I didn't dare to go to school later. Next slide. So participants report that gender intersect with their disability identity to shape the experience of school violence and bullying. This intersectionality both exists in disabled students as victim and non-disabled students as perpetrator. Male students of disability are more likely to experience physical attack, but they are more likely to fight back in this case, while social exclusion and emotional abuses are more prevalent among female students, according to our participants. For example, Zhihan, a male deaf person, he described that when I was in first grade, a boy who was quite fat always beat me. He also led other students to beat me together. Then I get very angry and punch into his mouth. His tooth dropped out because of my punch. Then students were afraid and they didn't dare to beat me together again. Besides, female group participants reported that they were more likely to experience bullying from male non-disabled students. For example, a girl whose nickname is I Have a Small Dream, she reported that gender definitely make a difference. There have always been more boys than girls who bully me when I grew up. There were much more boys who bully me with physical action. Next slide, please. And then participants identify teacher, school, family, cultural factor, and geographic location as the most salient contextual factor in China that mediate the occurrence, frequency, and severity of school bullying. First of all, participants generally suggest that teacher and the school are the most important contextual factor that worsen or decrease the extent of school bullying and violence they experience. However, it is very sad that most of them reported that teachers often fail to intervene in bullying and violence, even though disabled students repeatedly report to them. Also, many teachers are not capable of handling school bullying and violence because they had little experience interacting with disabled students, and those do not know how to tackle their special needs. Family is also identified by participants as a contextual factor. Participants will report positive and negative experience of family intervention in school violence and bullying. Parents of disabled students might ignore their children's help seeking because their own negative conception of disability. A participant identified that the long-standing culture of collectivism in China that disencourage individual difference hinders students with disabilities inclusion in the educational setting. And lastly, geographic location and the imbalanced rural-urban development also make some students with disability more vulnerable to school violence. And the last one. So our participants, they make a number of recommendations for initiating institutional change to tackle school violence and bullying against disabled students. First of all, they believe that school violence prevention training are the most important to hold among teachers, students, and also students' parents. And also, they think that cultural changes are needed in the whole educational system so that it can be more inclusive for every student. And thirdly, accessibility and reasonable accommodation should be increased in the educational system and also beyond. And lastly, they call for disability inclusive, gender sensitive, and also cultural specific response. I will end my presentation with a quote from Fei. So she said, I think the school should have a cultural change that not everyone is supposed to be the same. Quite the contrary, everyone should be different and learn to live together with people who are different. Thank you. I will pass back to you, Megan.
Thanks, Jacinth. It's so helpful. It was so helpful to have input from students talking about their own experiences while in school. So to continue the theme of what can be done, one of the main themes that came across in all stakeholder interviews was the idea that it takes a whole education approach. And so this is a list of some of the factors that could include, which would be inclusive laws, policy strategies that prohibit school violence and are specifically inclusive of students with disabilities, training and support for teachers to promote inclusion of all learners, curriculum development and teaching to challenge discriminatory norms, and so on. I'm going to talk about just two of these real briefly. One of the things that came out in every stakeholder interview and in the focus groups was the need to create an inclusive school environment, an inclusive school culture in which students with disabilities were treated as valued members of the school community. And data in the literature back this up. Some studies have shown that where teachers encourage students with and without disabilities to play together, students with disabilities are less likely to be bullied. Where schools are also strict about responding to bullying and intervening, students with disabilities report better experiences. In one study comparing bullying in deaf schools, researchers found much higher rates of victimization within the deaf schools than those among hearing students in mainstream schools. But they also found that teachers in the deaf schools were much less likely to intervene compared with teachers in the mainstream schools. And so what they concluded, that it wasn't differences in student behavior, but rather it was failures of the adults to intervene and take bullying seriously that allowed the bullying to continue. Stakeholders have also pointed out the need for involvement of students with disabilities in student activities. And that includes student committees, extracurricular activities, and student leadership. When students with disabilities are recognized as active members of the school community, it reduces stigma, increases awareness of violence and bullying, and levels of peer abuse go down. Student activities also provide an alternative forum through which students with disabilities can share their experiences in school and can report violence. There's substantial evidence that suggests that students with disabilities face significant barriers to reporting violence, which would include environmental barriers, communication barriers, and institutional barriers. So this could vary from inaccessible modes of reporting, inability to share. We also heard from a number of students that they didn't believe that their voices mattered, that anyone would do anything, and so on. And so providing spaces in which students can join with other students and have alternative ways of sharing their own experiences at school and in the school environment can be a critical mechanism for reducing school violence and bullying. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Julia McGowan. Julia is a Global Inclusive Education Specialist with Humanity and Inclusion. Julia was we interviewed Julia for this study, and she said one of the things that I found so important, and that is, creating an inclusive environment, we tend to think quite a lot about how expensive it is and the resources that it takes. And what Julia said is it's all about the attitude. And so I'm going to turn it over to you, Julia, and ask you if you can share a little bit more. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Megan. I hope you can all hear me. Absolutely. I think that at the heart of what we do in humanity and inclusion is all about changing attitudes. And so for me, if you're going to, solve this challenge and create an inclusive environment and make inclusive education really work, you have to start with changing the mindset, changing the attitudes. And just before I go on to say that we have three main things that we focus on in all our projects in about 27 countries, and they all have these three core areas. The first is on changing community attitudes, making sure everybody has understands what the challenges are, and also is really aware of how to reduce and break down stigma and discrimination. And that's really key. The other areas are what you might expect in terms of supporting service and supporting also at national level in terms of policies. But for us, that's the number one in terms of attitude change. So I'll give you some examples about how this can actually work in practice. So in Sierra Leone, we have a project there where we're working, and it's really important for us that the students themselves get involved in the solutions. Obviously, we need to change the hearts and minds of the teachers and the community, as I said, and teacher training is fundamental to that. But in order to set up this kind of inclusive culture at school level, you really need to get the other children, the other peers on board. So they have a system of a kind of school council where children with and without disabilities can be involved in that. And all the children can also be involved in a process called scorecarding, which is kind of around giving their opinions on the different things that matter to them in school. And then there's also a system of complaints boxes, which we have in other projects, where again, it's an anonymous way that students can have to, basically complain about things that aren't feeling right for them, but maybe they don't have the confidence to want to speak up about it in class, but they want to put an anonymous note in the complaints box. The important point is there's some sort of accountability for this. There's no point setting up these kind of approaches if there's no repercussion. So, it's important that the school is on board, and there's a sort of, we sometimes have like a school inclusion team or a core group of people at school level who really are, trying to champion the cause of inclusion. And then they're the ones to make sure that, these various issues that might be raised through all these different avenues are actually dealt with, so, if there's some sort of recourse for action, this is followed up. And then the children begin to see that there's a point to this process and things do start to change. Another thing I wanted to highlight is the importance of involving children themselves in sort of awareness raising activities. I think Mohamed earlier on was mentioning the importance of awareness raising at community level, and I fully agree. And I think that in order to tackle issues around bullying, really, we've seen it really work well. I think in Rwanda and Mozambique, I'm thinking of projects where, when you have children with and without disabilities in kind of groups, we call them child clubs sometimes, or different names and different settings, but they can, create drama, maybe theatre, dance, music, about the importance of inclusion. And this message that they will spread to other villages, to go to school to other places, to talk about this issue, but in a kind of fun way that's engaging with the audience. So these are kinds of approaches that, are simple to, or relatively cheap to set up, but can really have an impact. And also role plays, seeing what the challenges are and understanding the, what it feels like to be bullied, and sort of seeing what the outcomes could be. I think it's just important to get the other peers on involved. And one more point, if I may, is around sort of the preparation and the kind of, for example, if students with somebody new is going to come to the school, whether they have a disability or not, it's important that the other students in the class are made aware of that. And I think especially if somebody is coming and that's before they arrive, you can do things like circle of friends to try and encourage a few students to meet the new student arriving, to make them feel more at home in the school. and also, you know, preparing the rest of the class for the new student that might be arriving, to sort of so that it's not so challenging, that sudden transition into the school for the new student, especially a student with a disability. So these are just some examples that really, the core of it all is to have this inclusive culture at school level. And absolutely, going back to Mohamed's point, you know, for us, inclusive education is not just about the bricks and mortar, you know, accessible classrooms and that kind of thing. It's much more around, you know, the culture, the atmosphere in the school. You know, is there a child-friendly environment? Are the children in fear of the teachers, or are the teachers modeling that kind of positive energy and positive teaching and discipline that basically creates a more less fearful environment and creates you know, an atmosphere where children can feel at ease. And it's often seen that if the teachers are in that way and they are made positive with their students, then you know, students learn from that. So, you know, if the teacher, for example, is mocking the students, which can happen, sadly, you know, maybe making fun of their disability or teasing them for being slow or answering, then of course the students are going to think that's okay and do something similar. So it's really very much around, you know, the teachers being able to model the good behavior and the way, you know, the way that it's best to interact and create this culture and atmosphere of a positive learning experience, so that the students in the classroom are able to feed off that. Yeah, I'll stop there. I don't want to take too much time.
Thank you so much, Julia. So now we're going to be moving on to, I think it's going to be a very special part of our presentation, and that's to talk to two undergraduate students at the University of Washington who participated on the research team for this report as Disability Inclusive Development Initiative Summer Fellows. And so first, I would like to introduce Buri Tim Tiasvanakul. Tim just recently graduated as a double major in Law, Societies, and Justice and Psychology at the UW. And he is joining us from Bangkok, Thailand. So you might get the award for the person up the latest or up the earliest. And secondly, I would like to introduce Maha Khan. Maha is a third-year student majoring in Law, Societies, and Justice and minoring in Human Rights. And so Maha and Tim together with their classmates, Catherine Chamblin, who spoke last week at UNESCO's event, Maya Forte and Sarah Spikes, were really instrumental this past summer in helping Megan and I put together this report. They were also excellent as participants in many of the interviews with our key informants and in helping to coordinate focus groups with other young people around the world to discuss their observations and experiences with school violence and bullying. And so I'd like to begin our panel together by asking Maha and Tim a couple of questions. And the first question for the both of you is, why do you think it matters having young people with disabilities taking an active role in research? Why is that important? And then also, what did you learn from these focus groups and interviews that you participated in?
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. I think I learned a lot from through the process of researching and putting together this report. And I think it matters a lot for young people with disabilities to be actively involved in research and related fields, especially in academia, where people with disabilities are often seen as subjects, but often their needs aren't necessarily considered, as they're not seen as being able to make decisions for themselves. And I think in order for academia and research fields to be truly inclusive, it's really important to do more than just consider their needs. And it's important to give people with disabilities control of the narrative and allow them to voice and meet their own needs and be active leaders in all these fields. Because I think a lot of the times, the idea is that people with disabilities don't exist in academia or research, which is obviously not true at all. And it's important for people with disabilities to be treated as fully capable and intelligent and able to give input and have control of the information and the research that's being conducted. And I think it's important, again, not to just consider it as like an afterthought or like a token, but for the input of people with disabilities to be essential and non-negotiable. And I think something that kind of encapsulates that I heard Risakat Mohamed say from the Women with Disabilities Self-Reliance Foundation is that true inclusion is when people use their own voices and represent themselves rather than just being like an afterthought or being spoken for. So that's kind of the main thing that I learned.
Yeah, thank you, Maha. And also the idea that persons with disabilities, researchers with disabilities should be asking the questions rather than only answering the questions, right? Really driving that research agenda. Thank you. Tim?
Well, jumping off of Maha's response, I think it's interesting how oftentimes in academic research, we tend to put a lot of focus and value in peer-reviewed formal literature for various reasons, whereas stories tend to hold a different and perhaps lesser weight. But I think it would have been remiss and we would have told an incomplete story if we did not include narratives that came directly from persons with disabilities. And I think this connects with one of the priorities that we had discussed within the research team, which was recognizing the power and value of storytelling. Here, I think the value goes both ways in terms of the information we gathered, but I think also a space where persons with disabilities were given freedom in how they chose to navigate the current research with their own knowledge, experiences, and expertise around school-based violence. And I think that it was really through listening to the stories that came from persons with disabilities where I felt that the direction of our research was headed towards closing the gap between fancy academia language and the realities persons with disabilities face at the granular level.
Yeah, and just thinking about that, Tim, you know, I think many people would agree the most powerful part of today's presentation, though, so far, has been Shuxin's presentation on the findings in China, right? That, you know, hearing from young people with disabilities, their stories tells us far more than any statistics or any kind of study is going to tell us, and really what it looks like on the ground in everyday life. So another question I have for the both of you, and to really contextualize this for our audience, you know, as Megan mentioned when she talked about the study, is we did focus groups around the world. And one of the focus groups that we did with young people was on the University of Washington's campus. And so bringing it, you know, looking globally, but looking locally. And so with that, I'm interested to know from the two of you, what do you think can be done on campus, the University of Washington's campus or any university campus, to reduce school violence and bullying and promote more inclusion of students with disabilities?
Yeah, so I think in terms of reducing school-based violence, one of the key takeaways for me came after observing the focus group at the University of Pretoria, where an individual had said that persons with disabilities felt as though in order to gain validation, they felt pressure to prove their own personal vulnerabilities. And this meant that if they wanted to advocate for change, they needed to disclose personal experiences around school-based violence in order for any changes to occur. And I remember how almost everybody in that group agreed to how exhausting it was having to carry the burden of playing the roles of both student and advocate at the same time. And with this in mind, I think this sentiment needs to be carefully addressed and reflected in whatever process used to identify and reduce experiences of school-based violence in terms of creating an identity-sensitive feedback mechanism. Additionally, importantly, I also remember how much Julia Magone believed attitude and mindset were key towards creating sustainable solutions towards school-based violence. Because when we address negative attitudes and mindsets, it becomes easier to create an atmosphere that is inclusive from the very little to the very big things that matter.
Wow, yeah, that point, but also your first point, this idea that not only are students with disabilities often the targets of violence and bullying, but they're also oftentimes given the job of changing that situation, having to be the advocates themselves, where really it's everyone's responsibility, not their responsibility. Yeah, and Maha, what do you think can be done on campus?
So I definitely fully agree with Tim's points. And I think in terms of inclusivity, especially on college campuses, it's really important for us to at least start with like the most basic and fundamental levels of inclusion, which includes like physical accessibility and readily available accommodations, which I've noticed, especially since doing work with students with disabilities, I've kind of noticed that oftentimes, like walking around campus or attending online classes, a lot of these things are somewhat lacking. So I think accessible buildings, closed captions on recorded lectures, translators, like some form of faculty and staff training, disability accessible language materials and things like that need to be much more normalized, because I think as it stands, it's kind of something that's seen as special treatment a lot of the times, especially like Tim was saying, when someone doesn't necessarily want to disclose like all levels of their disability. So I think making sure that disability accommodations are seen as normal and expected, rather than something that is like special treatment again, or something that alienates people or makes their peers see them as different, is really important in order to make disability seen as something that's typical and normal and acceptable. And I think also it's really important for campuses to have productive avenues for students with disabilities to voice complaints or make accommodation requests and things like that safely and quickly, so that they don't have to like jump through a lot of bureaucratic hoops and things like that, again, to make it inclusive and normal. So I think making sure that students with disabilities are seen and made valid and seen as normal and integral parts of our society and our school society, and listening to their voices and allowing them to make the decisions about inclusion and accessibility is really important, and would help with addressing a lot of the negative attitudes towards disability, especially in a school setting.
Yeah, well, such an important point. You know, the idea that oftentimes students with disabilities have to justify the accommodations that they have a right to, right? And thinking about earlier in the presentation, the discussion around teachers as being bullies, and knowing what was some of the findings from the University of Washington's focus group. One of the points that came out of that is oftentimes faculty members force students with disabilities to justify and explain why they need a certain accommodation, rather than simply recognizing someone's right and not needing further information, not needing you to disclose your disability and explain your disability. Instead, you simply need recognition of the rights. Well, thank you both so much. And I'm going to ask you to stay on screen because we've reached the time where we're going to ask all of our panelists to turn their videos back on and open things up for our question and answer period. And so as I've said, and I know a couple people have taken advantage of this, you can chat your questions. You can put your questions into the chat screen, and hopefully Mohamed, you could join us as well for our questions.
Yes, I'm here.
Great, thank you. And so I've prepared a couple questions, and then I'm also going to pull some of the questions off of the chat that we've gotten. But actually, Mohamed, the first question I have for you, but it's really open to everybody. That is, it's very clear the role of schools and governments need to play But as executive director of Disabled People International, I want to ask you, what's the proper role? What's the best role that disabled persons organizations can play in addressing school violence and bullying among students with disabilities? And how best can governments, schools, NGOs, researchers, and others involve disabled persons organizations?
There are several ways in which that DPOs or disabled people's organizations can be taking part in the process of transforming sociocultural settings and people's mindset about schooling for children with disabilities. Number one, and for me, it's a priority strategy, is for DPOs to be, proactive and out front, exploring and trying to collect information through their constituencies about experiences of persons with disabilities at schools. Number two is to believe that there is no solution for pushing the agenda of inclusion of persons with disabilities without addressing issues of schooling, especially inclusive education in mainstream schools. Therefore, DPOs has to find the right stakeholders and key players within civil society, within the organizations of teachers, schools, all sorts of stakeholders to work with on promoting the concept or the culture of inclusive education. The other more practical way for DPOs to get involved is, number one, to find out about the structure of human rights bodies in their countries and make sure that any problems such as bullying and other practices of exclusion or discrimination at schools, at mainstream schools, even through the perpetual role of special education institutions, to address these issues with human rights bodies in their countries and make sure that if their country is a country that is a member state of the CRPD, can report this to the CRPD committee at the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner in Geneva. The other thing is that we always try to encourage our fellows disabled people and their organizations to do is to engage in shadow reports with civil society organizations in case they have not been involved in any sort of like reporting about the implementation of education agenda or programs in light of the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 4, as our colleague from UNESCO has rightly spoken. To address these issues, to bring it up to the attention of the international community, so we can work together on pressuring governments and stakeholders on national level, and to try to, like today, this is an excellent example. The session that we are attending all today is an excellent example of places where organizations of persons with disabilities can be involved. To learn from each other experiences, to learn from your experience as specialists in policy development and as academician. And we are here as DPI, we are open and willing to continue this partnership with you and involve, so we can involve our members and other partners of organizations of persons with disabilities in such important initiatives.
Yeah, thank you, Mohamed. And that's such a, your point is really parallel to what Julia had been talking about, that at the school level, you need an accountability or a monitoring mechanism, whether that's students putting, complaints in an anonymous complaint box, but then at the national level, because the right to education is a state responsibility, it's a human right. Then you have to hold your ministries of education and your governments accountable. And the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is one mechanism for doing that through shadow reports, civil society reports, as well as national level human rights institutions.
Right.
We have a question from one of our participants, and I think it's going to be for Megan, and maybe if Parvez, if you're interested in joining us on this as well. But one of the questions talks, I think is really pointing to one of the findings that there's so little data coming from the global South, that the data that we have is overwhelmingly from North America and from Western Europe. And so, the question is, what would it take, or how can we start getting DPOs, NGOs, students, government ministries in places like Latin America, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, to start collecting the data that we need to really understand this issue. And I'm just gonna, kind of add to that point, and having worked on the study, is that it's not just having data, but it's having the right kind of data that we can compare it and really track progress over time, right? And so for Megan and Parvez, and Parvez, I'm wondering, what's UNESCO's role in collecting data, and also Megan, from your experiences and looking at the data, what's the data that's most important that we get, and how should it be collected?
Thank you, Stephen. I think I love the question. Personally, I'm a true believer of in data and evidence. I think that it is imperative that we collect data on core education indicators. And I'm one of the vocal advocates for data collection, analysis, and presenting in UNESCO. And when I saw the question, I was very glad that it was asked. It's true that collecting data on, and as Megan highlighted, people with disabilities in most of the parts of the world, in the especially global South, and those country contexts where institutionalization is implemented, unfortunately, they're invisible, and a lot needs to be done. And to collect the data. One of the things I can say that one of the barriers that we have in terms of collecting data on disability in the education sector is the absence or lack of unified framework for measuring or categorizing the information on functioning and disability. Here I remember the International Classification of Functioning, Disability and Health, where most of the countries, WHO member states approved, where helps and sets the standards and measurement tools to identify and present the data in a way that is comparable around the globe. But then it presents its own challenges. It means that changing the mindset of not only of those concerned, but the government officials, policymakers. I would say it's very important that the governments align their system. So I'm talking about their administrative data sources, education management information system, health management information system, so that they rightly align the definitions, indicators, so that they can give feedback to different data collection mechanisms. There are, as you know, global data surveys like global school-based student health surveys, health behavior, school-age children study, HSBC. There are different student learner surveys like PISA, ERSHE, TIMSS, PEARLS. They all collect information from students, and then there is we generate good chunk of data on the experience of people or students of violence and bullying, and this was one of our great data sources for the Behind the Number report. What we need to do here is to come up with a common measurement tool. It's not an easy job, as you know, because the definition varies. As I said, there are different interpretations, and that's why we need to, as stakeholders, as UN agencies, together with INGOs, the organization of disabled people need to come together and come up with a common measurement tool that would kind of inform the expansion of different surveys that are available globally, so that we can start collecting data, particularly on about the experience of learners with disabilities. There I want to end, and I would like to hear Megan what she has to say. Over.
Yeah, no, well, I think I would say exactly the same thing about having a common tool, because that is one of the things that presented such a challenge when it came to analyzing the data, the studies that were part of this review, is that just the idea of disability was so different across studies. And so thinking about whether it's the use of the Washington Group set of questions on disability, having an agreement on sort of using that as a common framework for identifying and describing persons with disabilities, young people with disabilities, so that they can be greater comparability. I mean, we struggled with not only sort of the way that disability was being approached in various studies, you know, particularly depending on geographic location, but also the way schools were being defined, school settings. So for example, what is a mainstream school versus what is a segregated school versus what is a special school versus a residential versus an institution? And so trying to identify what any given study meant when they were talking about which set of students was very challenging, and it became clear that there was no uniform definition even of understanding what an institution is and when it is or isn't a residential school, which creates significant challenges both from comparisons but also from sort of understanding, you know, really being able to dig deep and understand what students are we talking about and what experiences, where are they, and how is that context affecting their experiences. Also age as opposed to grade level. Many studies used grade level as a way of creating, you know, defining their participant pool versus age. And when you know, in a lot of cases, grade level and students with disabilities may be in a grade that does not necessarily match the age of other students in that grade. And so it's difficult to know, again, how old. I mean, we could be talking about a range of ages in any one particular grade, depending on which students are included and how. And so there's a variety of different ways in which just kind of coming to particularly for this topic, coming to an agreed set of definitions or a sort of a common tool for measuring would be incredibly helpful.
Yeah, I mean, just not to pile on Megan on that, but another thing that we encountered was that there were different definitions of bullying or different ways of asking the questions. So some surveys ask, were you bullied in the past month? And others ask, were you teased? Or were you picked on? Or were you in a fight over the past month? And you get very different results. And then surveys that ask students, others that would ask parents, and others that would ask teachers, sometimes around the same child. Did they experience bullying? Did they experience violence? And you would have different numbers from each of those, you know, depending on the source of the information. So we only have about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to open this up to all of the panelists for everyone, the last question. And the question I want to ask is that, in today's seminar, in today's webinar, I believe we have educators that are participating. We have people that work for NGOs and others that are working, locally, globally, that are participants today. And so as we can see, school violence and bullying involving students with disabilities is a complex issue. And in many places, it hasn't even begun to be addressed, right? That it's not part of the dialogue, it's not part of the conversation. And so from each of your perspectives, I'm interested if you were advising somebody that, works for an education NGO, but not one that has thought about inclusive education or one that has really addressed bullying, where would you tell them to begin? What is the first step that they should be taking to start addressing this issue and start creating a more inclusive and safe school environment for students with disabilities.
If I may start, Steve.
Please.
Sure. Number one, we have to remember two things. Number one, bullying does not take place only at mainstream schools. There is much worse happening at segregating institutions. And I'm sure through the survey you've done, you may have come across such experiences. So we need to use bullying not as an idea or something that would hold us back in promoting the concept of inclusion of persons with disabilities. We should use it as a way to push us forward in order to promote the agenda of inclusion. We need to work together on identifying ways for transforming the sociocultural mindset of society towards persons with disabilities in general, and students or children with disabilities in particular in this case. The second thing is culture is very important, where like in countries, especially in developing countries, where children with disabilities are not exposed to the opportunity of learning to have self-confidence, to have more opportunities of empowerment, expressing themselves, and also to make sure that society trusts or believes in what these children are saying. This is why I'm sure you have received various numbers of feedback on whether children have would share their experience in terms of bullying. We need to trust children, and we need also to make sure that stakeholders are taking into consideration this bullying issue into account very seriously. Data or national statisticians or statistics office bureaus have to take this into consideration. Whoever asked about data, I think in the chat somebody was saying that we need to use or take advantage of the Washington Group and the CSF of the World Health Organization, but I think we need to also expand those and work together on making sure that children with disabilities, number one, feel safe to share their experiences, and we should share this with policymakers and make sure that policymakers would trust organizations of persons with disabilities, children with disabilities, and their parents when it comes to issues of bullying and addressing these issues, especially through human rights bodies and shadow reports. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. Yeah, I'd like to ask that question to Julia, because I know that you, through Humanity and Inclusion, spend a lot of time working in communities for the, as kind of the first actor, the first one addressing this issue. So where do you begin, or where should others begin?
Well, I agree with all your recent points, Mohamed, so I won't repeat them. I was going to add a couple of I suppose, relatively easy things for them to start with, because it is, I guess, from an education NGO new to this, they have to start with something they could see what could they do straight away. One would be to open up their teacher training programs to make sure persons with disabilities can be part of that, because quite often you find that they are excluded for various reasons. So that, to advocate towards that not happening, and to also actively encourage more persons with disabilities applying, as we often do in the gender field, try to encourage more females to apply to become teacher trainees. So that would be one simple start. Things around themselves, when they collect their own data, and the NGO could disaggregate it, for disability as well as gender, so that, look in your own house first, as well as at national level, look at what your own NGO is doing. Are you actually even collecting this data? When we worked with mainstream organizations, as we often do in consortium, we sometimes find that they, are already working with children with disabilities that they didn't know, because they'd not done any assessment on who their beneficiaries were, and therefore weren't putting any accommodations in or any supports. So it's around just also supporting what they already have, and making sure that they use something standardized. So I agree to the point about the Washington Group maybe not being enough, but it's a really good starting point, I think, especially when you're working with mainstream organizations trying to get to be part of this process. So I think at least by using something that you can relatively easily use within an NGO setting, but also a government level. You know, it does bring at least some element of comparative data collection. But I acknowledge the fact it's not the silver bullet. It's not everything, but it's at least something. And I think it is good to promote that use, to have something a bit more standardized.
Okay, great. And so we're running out of time, but one thing that I think we've heard over and over today is that when we're tackling these issues, the most important thing we can do is to listen to young persons with disabilities themselves. And so I do want to give a minute to Shusin, Tim, and Maha, because you're the ones that were talking to young persons with disabilities and representing young persons with disabilities. In those conversations, in those focus groups, what did you hear? Where do you think we should begin?
Thank you, Stephen. I can begin answering this question. I think what I have learned from my group participants through this interview is that this is school violence and bullying. It's an issue that they really, really care about. When I started to coordinate with DPO in China to work on this project and recruiting participants, I got tons of people who signed up for this group interview. And then during our focus group interview, people talk for 2 hours, more than 2 hours in each of the group to talk about openly about their experience of school violence and bullying that they never been able to talk about before. And then they all asked us to really work on this issue, and to some of them even agree to use their name openly and to really open up their own experience, which is some very tremendous for many of them. So I think this is a really important thing that we are doing here to enable people with disability to have the opportunity to express their own experience and to work on that. And in reciprocal, I think it's really important for us to really take this reciprocal to address this issue and to tackle this, listen to their voice and work on this issue all together.
Thank you. Okay, well, I think we're over time. And so what I'd like to do is first thank all of our panelists for their excellent contributions today. I'd also like to thank our supporters and partners, which include Disabled People International, Humanity and Inclusion, UNESCO, the Disability Studies Program at the UW, and the Office of Global Affairs for helping us today, and for making this possible today, as well as the Carnegie Corporation of New York, which funds the Disability Inclusive Development Initiative. And I'm going to make a bold prediction. I don't think it's that bold. But I'm going to predict that this won't be the last webinar that we do on this topic, because if we found anything out from this report is that we need to know a lot more, and we need to increase the number of people that know about it, right? That we both don't have enough data, we don't have enough research on this topic, but we also don't have enough people involved. So I hope to see everybody back on Zoom some point in the near future. So I'd like to thank all of our participants today, and have a good rest of the week. All right, thank you.